Hi guys, and welcome to another edition of The Kevin Moore Show. Now on today's show, I'm about to be joined by my guest, Frank Piscati, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and certified hypnotherapist with a private practice in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, he's founder and president of Associated Clinicians of Virginia, which provides psychotherapy and organizational development services to individuals and businesses. Now, he joins me today to discuss how life's ordeals can lead to personal and spiritual transformation. Frank Piscati, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you for coming on. Now, your latest book, Chrysalis Crisis, How Life's Ordeals Can Lead to Personal and Spiritual Transformation. What led you to sort of write this book to begin with?
Well, I actually was examining the main reasons why people come into psychotherapy over the past 45 years that I've been doing it. And I was intrigued by both the kinds of concerns that would be considered more conventional kinds of problems. And over the years, I tried to understand some exceptional experiences people have had that might be considered spiritual emergencies, experiences like near-death experiences, NDEs, or perceptions that they're having that might be considered psychic. And as a clinical psychologist, I was wondering how those experiences would fit in with the more, particularly when they develop into a crisis, and how they would fit in with other more conventional problems, like maybe the loss of somebody or death in a family or something that brings people in for therapy.
So what was the interest in psychology then, and sort of mixing that in with the sort of near-death experiences, psychic experience, anything in the spiritual realm? How do those two crossroads in your career meet?
Well, interestingly, like a psychologist often suggests, it goes back to my childhood. I had a family where there was both two significant influences, I guess, in that area of spirituality. One was a Catholic upbringing in the city of Newark, New Jersey, where I went to Catholic schools and got a heavy dose of Catholicism. And the other piece was a grandfather who came over from Italy and who was influenced by the spiritualist movement coming out of the 19th century, and who, along with a couple of his sons and my mother, became intrigued with psychic phenomena and some other experiences that they had heard about. So in an attempt to try to integrate the both, I was always curious as to what of these experiences are legitimate? Are these just things that have been mentioned to me in my family and maybe being indoctrinated? And so I was always curious about how do we really look at these things? Are they valid? And how would I understand those in light of the conventional training I've had as a clinical psychologist? So I'd say it goes way back. And then in my doctoral program, I just happened to have a client show up who had a near-death experience. This is back in the middle 70s, before it had become as well known as it is now. And so I was challenged in working with him as a clinician on a staff at Michigan State University to try to work with him in a way that would be consistent with what we know about doing psychotherapy, but also trying to hold a place and a space for the possibility that some of his experiences were valid. They were definitely creating a crisis in his life, and he even sounded to the intake person who did the intake with him before I picked him up on my caseload, like he might have a thought disorder. Maybe there was something going on. Maybe he is psychotic. He came in saying he was fearful that he was the angel of death because he had had a near-death experience earlier in the year. And then he started having a couple of precognitions, dreams of things happening to people that indeed did pan out. And so he wasn't sure what was going on. It caused him a crisis. He was worrying that maybe he was the cause of these problems. And so it was a challenge for me to hold on to the integrity of being a clinician in training, and to see if I had the latitude in my program to start considering, might there be other explanations for these experiences.
And I guess that journey of considering are there other explanations has taken you a lifetime's worth of work, in a sense, as well, and continues.
Pretty much, yeah. And actually, in the supervision I received, the one I was really happy that my my supervisor was willing to allow me to say, hold as a tenable truth, that maybe these experiences he was having were valid, and then it challenges us to say, well, if that's true, how do we understand these? What causes them? How does the mind work that these experiences can be had? And at the time, interestingly, down the road, about 85 miles at another University of Michigan, there's a colleague and friend of mine now who I had no idea was working in the area of near-death experiences. And in the very town I'm in now, Charlottesville, Virginia, there was a fellow who wrote a book called Life After Life, and Raymond Moody, and he was just coming out with some research to show that people who had NDEs were starting to come out of the closet and less fearful they were going to be considered crazy. And then later on in the research, they found that people who have near-death experiences, there seems to be a loosening of the tethering to physicality, and they do seem to be more inclined to have psychic experiences, which was fitting for him, but I did not have that information at the time.
Wow. Okay. And where has your work gone then? I mean, what direction did it go in?
Well, literally, it ended up contributing in part to me moving from Michigan to Charlottesville, Virginia, where at the medical school here at the University of Virginia, there's actually a program called the Division of Perceptual Studies, where they have serious researchers researching areas like reincarnation and mediumship and near-death experiences and psychic phenomena. And when I was coming out of my training, I thought, well, that might be an interesting area to settle into because I'd be nearby. And the people, this is a legitimate program that's been around since the 60s. It took a lot of courage to start because many universities who had similar programs were fearful of being, thought to be not serious researchers. But the university here has had the courage to maintain this program. And so the offshoot of that is when I showed an interest in this area, largely as a clinician working in the community, when people would have these anomalous experiences, sometimes they get nervous and frightened and they go looking, particularly these days on the internet, they go looking for who can tell something about this stuff. And so they end up contacting this program, which we call DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies. And they don't do therapy there. They do research. So they were referring these people to me over the years. They and a couple of other not similar, but a couple of other legitimate groups around the area who have people gravitate towards them. And sometimes they have what are called spiritual emergencies. And the people who have them, that sometimes they're afraid to come out and tell, psychotherapists. They're afraid they're going to get a diagnosis that's abnormal. But at the same time, they're also frightened because oftentimes they're the ones who say, I'm afraid I'm losing my mind. Maybe I'm crazy. I had these experiences. Tell me what they're about or help me understand myself. So.
Now, every time I think of the University of Virginia or the School of Medicine, I always think of the Edgar Cayce Center. Of course, they're not linked, but there is the great Edgar Cayce Center at Virginia Beach.
Right.
Just kind of on your doorstep.
Well, it is really, and actually, in the family I grew up in, they were big readers of Edgar Cayce material, as well as J.B. Rhine's material down at Duke University. He was the person who was doing research down there, and that was a very noted program, still exists. And he's the man who coined ESP. And in my own mother's library and a couple of my uncles, they had books on Edgar Cayce and J.B. Rhine and all of these. There was another organization called the Rosicrucians, which is a non-sectarian mystical organization that also had a strong influence in our family in which people came to learn about some of these phenomena, some of which I had heard through those sources before I got into my training as a clinical psychologist, and kind of wondered, how do we understand this stuff? How are we going to, how do we hold on to the integrity of what we know about how the mind works in the unconscious, and at the same time hold as possibly valid that these experiences they're less common. One of the ways in which I differentiate them is, and this is not my own thinking, but a man by the name of Frederick Myers back at the turn of the 19th century, along with William James, by the way, who's considered the father of American psychology. They were both intrigued by these phenomena, and they started a psychical organization where they researched these. And so what happened for me was, it was like, wow, if there's the people who are that credible and they're understanding these. Frederick Myers, for instance, would say, The challenge is to differentiate between abnormal and what he called supernormal. So it's not, these things are not, well, they're not normal because, if you put them on a normal curve, they're outliers. A lot of people have these experiences, but they're not necessarily pathological. And what happens in the field sometimes is particularly in psychology, they'll reach for other reasons for explaining them. They'll say, well, maybe somebody's not having an out-of-body experience, but maybe they're dissociating, or maybe they're not really doing any kind of mediumship. Maybe they're multiple personality disorders. So there's always like another explanation, which may or may not apply. In some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't.
And have you come across that? Have you come across that in clients?
For sure, and I try to do what we call like a differential diagnosis and say, well, my first thought is this person, are there any reason why they might be lying to me? Are they delusional? Are they psychotic? Are they, having hallucinations and thinking these things are real? So you got to rule that out, of course, and you do it with, a certain amount of integrity. And and then when you rule all those things out, then it's left with the person's bringing the experience in, and you have to help them understand it. And that's kind of what the book's about. It's sort of like saying this is an exceptional experience, but there's a lot of research out there to support the fact that these phenomena are real. And oftentimes people are just, they're just comforted by knowing that they're not losing their mind and that there really are people out there, credible researchers, who can give them information about these experiences.
So you're still a licensed clinical psychologist, and are you still a certified hypnotherapist?
I am, and I do use hypnotherapy. I've also had some alternative kinds of training along the way. Back about 25 years ago, I thought, one of the probably the best ways of going about looking at these alternative approaches to working with people, those that might be able to get people into altered states of consciousness that might be conducive to having some of these experiences, was to go experience them myself. So I came to England, for instance, and worked with a man by the name of Roger Woolger, who was a past life therapist, and trained with him for a couple of years, and went down to Peru and worked with a shaman for a while, who came up here on a couple of occasions, and a couple of other folks in the field of transpersonal psychology, like Stan Grof, who's a psychiatrist, Czechoslovakian psychiatrist, who's considered the father of transpersonal psychology. So I had a number of experiences with different organizations, and I was fascinated, and particularly the kinds of states people can go into under hypnosis, or just altered states, which seems to slightly change the channel, if you will, enough where some of these very subtle experiences can be had. So that is how I kind of I'll use hypnotherapy. Sometimes people say, help me stop smoking. I don't do that kind of work. I kind of use it as what you might call a mining technique. Sometimes people, they can't quite access experiences that may be traumatize them in a very conventional way. So, after a while, you kind of have a sense that, hey, if I can help this person access that, experience the feelings without being re-traumatized, that they may also be able to integrate it in a way they weren't able to at first.
Is that mainly is that mainly in person that you do those kind of sessions?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, these days now with video, people are now saying, hey, you can do some work with people. I would not feel comfortable, as a matter of fact, doing any regression, what's called regressive hypnosis like that, unless I've worked with a person and I feel that they're pretty grounded and solid and they can tolerate, maybe dropping into an altered state and feeling feelings. Because, sometimes if somebody isn't well grounded, you start moving them into places where they're, maybe defending against for good reason, and you don't want to have somebody decompensate, and especially if it was a video with somebody across the pond, so to speak. How are you going to pieces with them? So I do it I only do it directly in the room.
So going to your book, or your latest book, How Life's Ordeals Can Lead to Personal and Spiritual Transformation. How do we get to that? If we're going through an ordeal of some sort, right? how can it lead to a personal or spiritual transformation, in a sense?
Well, let me say that I break out 10 key areas, very broad areas, where people tend to, over the years, have brought in issues that seem to implicate one or a number of these areas. So I break them out into physical, intellectual, emotional, social, and moral. and then that consider those foundational areas, and then I have there's other three areas that I call more personal areas of identity crises or intimacy crises, more in terms of the inability to be open and share, or existential crises like the loss of meaning and purpose, something people might go through at midlife. And then in the last section, the transpersonal section, I'll talk about intuitive crises, which maybe implicate psychic experiences, or spiritual crises, which I usually define as actually having an experience of spirit, which might be being out of your body in an NDE, or beholding what you perceive to be as an apparition, or something like that. So let me give you a conventional way in which people can transform. Let's say somebody you love dies, and you're blown away by that experience, and so you go see a therapist, and the initial work is going to be trying to help you get grounded again and deal with the many ways in which your life is going to have to adjust in the aftermath of this crisis. But then there's usually a pivot point where people I'll find, like, say, somebody who's very cerebral and very intellectual. In order to get through the experience of losing somebody they love, they may not be as aware of how they feel. Like, you might say they have a much higher intellectual IQ than they have an emotional IQ. So at some point, my work might be trying to help them get in touch with feelings. They might have beliefs, like maybe they did something wrong in their life and they think that losing their spouse is a punishment. So you start doing some cognitive work. But the work that you do, like, so many people could lose somebody significant, but the kind of work they may do in the aftermath will awaken them to aspects of themselves that maybe they had not developed. So you talk about a pre-morbid state, like maybe somebody who was very cerebral, wasn't aware of feelings, loses somebody they love, and then all the work is about them awakening to their sadness or their anger or their fear. And so there's where the transformation comes in, and all of a sudden it's like they're not going to forget how sad it was to lose somebody they love, but they'll realize that that crisis in their life actually opened them up to growth and transformation in another area. They may be more, I use an example in the book of a fellow who was a physicist, and he's a composite figure of people I've worked with in town, brilliant man, who lost somebody he loved. And he was very, you might say he had a very low emotional IQ and social IQ. He was much more of a reclusive guy. And when his wife died, he had to come out. He had to deal with raising his kids, and he had to learn how to deal with their feelings and his feelings, and interact at school now with them and come out and engage with people. So in these two areas, it really prompted him to have to grow, and he did change significantly, not only getting over the loss of his wife, but in terms of just awakening more of his social capacity and his emotional capacity.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how why we have to go through such, turmoil for us to want to shift the person that we are. I mean, just sometimes it seems like we need a 10x4, don't we? Just to be able to, grow in a sense, I suppose.
It is unfortunate, and it is, there's a saying in psychotherapy, if people come in and just want to chat, it's not going anywhere. But if they come in and they're really in pain and they really are willing to be vulnerable and like open up in a way where they're going to probably do a lot of growing. It's tough. I mean, I've been there. Many of us have. Nobody comes away unscathed. We all have our experiences and crises in life, and not everybody, unfortunately, has the ability maybe to go to therapy. But if there's a window there where you may be more open to growth before you reconsolidate or you sort of like close up and get redefended again. And this happens all across the board. Like in those 10 key areas, it might be areas of emotion, changing your thinking, looking at social isolation issues. It also could be even learning how to be more intimate and open, which the process of psychotherapy requires. People who maybe keep their cards close to their chest and they're not used to being open and sharing intimately when they come in. Even with a therapist, even if they know it's safe and confidential, it may not be their nature to be that open. So that in itself can be a learning experience. And they kind of go out and they're more open with their friends and family.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess for some people, the idea of seeing a psychologist, it's scary, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Like you say, I mean, to have that openness with someone that you don't know, would tend to seem like easy to some people, but I don't know if it is so much sometimes.
I appreciate that it's not, and it just depends, because sometimes if you grow in a family where there's a range of openness where people do talk about more personal things. I mean, not all the time, But if you're used to sharing and opening up with others, it may not be quite as foreign. But if you're not, then you're really at a crossroad with yourself where you're realizing, gosh, I'm not going to be able to get to those places within myself where the confusions lie, maybe my thoughts that I'm not even aware of. I'll often say to people when they walk in the room, I'll say, there's no shame in not knowing. I mean, we talk about the unconscious, the areas of feeling or thoughts, or even some of these other gifts that we have that come out of this deeper part of who we are. I'll say, we all have blinders on. It keeps us humble. You, me, Sigmund Freud. We don't all know. It's all in there. And unless you invite somebody in, and with the spirit of saying, hey, let's go uncover some of these things together with no judgment or expectations, people are usually fascinated by what they discover.
Do you wish that more psychologists would be more open to the idea of consciousness and being a psychologist and being so open to the idea that we are a soul having a human body? Let me put it like that, right? But there's we are the I am, right? Has that changed your work to a level that you never thought you could go to professionally?
Well, I have to admit, I have so long in the tooth in my stage of my career, so I have a lot less to risk by taking some positions and bringing out some of the thoughts that I was more likely to sort of keep concealed or stay in the closet about. Back in the days when I first came to town in my beginning stages, I have 3 children, and I did not want to get marginalized because I want to be considered a solid clinician. But there was a lot of the kind of thinking at times where people would think, you're kind of flaky, or you're too new agey, or are we really going to be able to trust you? But the idea of consciousness in my book, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea of consciousness as the foundation of everything, and the fact that we are able to tap into dimensions of experience that arise out of that consciousness, including physicality. I mean, the shift that's going on right now in some thinking is that a lot of the brain imagery and a lot of the work people are doing with fMRIs and all these ways of saying, hey, this area of the brain heats up, or EEGs where you say this area of the brain's throwing off electrical impulses when this function is happening. The thinking for a long time has been that the brain gives rise to consciousness, and so therefore when you die, so goes consciousness. Then you start having experiences like NDEs where people are literally flatlined, brain is offline, and they have awareness, they have thoughts, they come back, they're cognating, and they're saying, how could that be? So you start thinking, well, maybe there's another state that we go into that is valid, that is something that isn't solely tied to physicality, which opens you up to thinking about, survival, life after death, not in a denial of it, but maybe in a way to say, who's to say, where's the ground here,
And what would you say are some of the benefits of people willing to explore that side of reality, or to even look into those subjects as well?
Well, I think, for example, there's good, solid research on people who have near-death experiences with out-of-body awareness, OBEs they call them. You can have an OBE, out-of-body experience, without having to come upon, nearly dying. But what happens is there's a significant loss of fear of death. And people do start feeling like, wow, they come back more purposefully. There's a sense of, in a classic sense, they may have a sense that they need to want to do something that's more meaningful in their life. It could also cause disruption. You have an experience like this. If somebody you love doesn't have an experience, it's like they may think you're nuts, and it could cause like some dissonance in your relationship. But generally, there are benefits. And again, what happens is I think people when you start having psychic experiences, and they're not frequent, but even in the 4,000-year-old Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, they'll say, as you work with states of meditation and yoga, you're going to learn to become more aware and mindful of those very subtle experiences that don't fit with how we've come to believe time and space work, and or consciousness. And when that happens, I think you stretch to start opening up to, okay, maybe this, we're certainly in a physical world and we need to learn how to master it to the extent where we're not enslaved by it, but we also have another sense that, hey, there might be purposefulness beyond just the physicality of it all.
Well, in your book, you do say that consciousness is the foundation of all that exists, and and that how you sort of differentiate consciousness from conscious.
Well, yeah, and they're often I mean, people who are not, like familiar with the terms will often say, well, I thought consciousness was conscious. Well, I'll say, well, your consciousness is always, you're always, like you're always, we're swimming in a sea of consciousness. Uh, you could be sleeping and be unconscious, but your consciousness is still there. You follow me? So you want to say there's a difference between areas when you talk about mindfulness, for example, which is a very familiar term these days with more people meditating. I think it's more like saying I want to increase my awareness of what my consciousness brings into focus for me. And the more I'm tuned in and the less I'm distracted by external preoccupations or the monkey mind that everybody deals with when you first start meditating, I'm able to register what crosses my threshold of awareness. And there's where you're saying I'm increasing my conscious awareness of what my consciousness brings before me and the range that I have. So that's how I would differentiate them.
Well, just going back now to the 10 keys. Now, the 10 keys, just remind me about them again, because obviously there's more to it than just 10 keys, isn't there? There's much more to these keys.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is the broadest way of looking at these different ways. I tend to think of them as like 10 key functions or a range or capacities that humans have where they manifest consciousness's potential. So, we have, if you will allow for the notion that consciousness gives rise to physicality, we have this physical experience. It's real. And one needs to learn how to master the physical. If you don't, I mean, even basic things like take care of your health or nutrition or manage your money. And there's so many ways that one can get completely consumed by and, myopically focused on just that dimension. It's hard to avoid because it's all around us. It's literally at hand, as they say. So physicality is broad, but it's not everything, because then you start realizing, how you think, mind body, right? And mind body could say, well, how you think can affect your physicality, or how you feel can affect what goes on in your physical world. And people don't necessarily. Sometimes the hardest work to do with people in therapy is getting them to not intellectualize about feelings, but actually experience them. So that's a hard one to work with a lot of times, because sometimes shrinks make the worst client. They gather the wagons better than most, and who wants to be vulnerable to feelings? So you have that as a third area. Socially, you have a lot of people who have social anxiety problems or who are just uncomfortable and maybe miss the social cues. And if they had that, there's a man by the name of Daniel Goleman who wrote a book on emotional IQ. He also wrote a book on social IQ. So you find people want to awaken to that capacity. And these are all different capacities. There's a Buddhist, a long-standing Buddhist school called Nichiren Buddhism, and they talk about consciousness as having various capacities. And so I would liken these 10 key areas as capacities. Now, that's not to say that consciousness doesn't manifest in like cells and plant life and animals, but there is a point where when consciousness rises to a point where we are self-aware, other areas of consciousness emerge. And maybe beyond the physical, where consciousness is predominantly abiding in spirit. So there's a whole range there. And any one of these can be a focus for therapy, by the way, but usually there's a couple that are going on at a given time. Like if somebody's going through a midlife crisis, maybe they're tuned into finding meaning now. Maybe they have, you know how that works. They might have spent their whole life getting their material things and they just feel that, that existential ache, but it also may require that they get in touch with what they feel or change their identity. All of a sudden they may be realizing, hey, I always thought of myself as like a master of the universe, and now I'm seeing myself as wanting to be, whatever, somebody.
Absolutely. Well, let's just look at some of these crises, because I think that it's just important just to touch on a few. And the obvious one, well, I say the obvious one, obviously it's one that I'm interested in, obviously the spiritual crisis as one of them. And I mean, how would you know if you're having what is a spiritual crisis, and how would you know you're having one?
Well, I was going to say spiritual area tends to be focused on when somebody presents what's called a spiritual emergency. And a spiritual emergency, according to the man who coined it, Stan Groff, is usually somebody is having an anomalous experience. And by that, I mean they might have what he would say anything from an out-of-body experience, precognition, where they have a dream about something and then it happens, or they maybe perceive what is considered to be an apparition, or they have maybe what feels like a dream that felt real as if it were a past life. And usually these kinds of things shake people up because they're very vivid and very, they're very striking. And those kinds of, or these days, sometimes people who are meditating for long periods of time or using mind-altering drugs sometimes will trigger a spiritual experience, because we know that many altered states can be very conducive to having paranormal phenomena occur. And when they come in, usually part of it is to help assure them that and be sure that they aren't losing their mind. But when it's not the case, then there's a lot of educating that needs to be done. And usually I encourage people to read because, they've already had the experience. They're needing to understand more about it and integrate it. And then usually they have never cared much about it, never thought anything about it before, or always thought it was a bunch of just hogwash. And then they have an experience and they're very motivated to try to understand what gave rise to that and what are my capacities. How could I have an experience like that? It doesn't fit with how I've been told the world works or my mind works. So that's how you have, those are what contribute to spiritual emergencies. And it usually just wakens you to the fact that you have a spiritual dimension.
Yeah, absolutely it does. Absolutely. And I suppose you've seen a few of these crises, but and you do put them in your book, I believe. But the sort of who am I now? The sort of identity crisis, in a sense.
Sure, and that can be both conventional. I use a story of a relative of mine who went through a very serious accident and had to redefine himself, and it was an inspiration to me in the way he did that. Yet there's other people who would say, even if they have a spiritual emergency, they almost say, I didn't realize I had this dimension to who I am. I never identified myself as being somebody who's going to have an experience that might be considered psychic, or like I said earlier, like somebody who's going through a midlife crisis, they may have to almost remake themselves. The man by the name of Erik Erikson said, identity changes throughout the life cycle. You can think about how expansive that can get. You think about yourself as a man, and you think yourself, the national identity, and then you think about a worldly identity, and think of spiritual identity. I mean, you're constantly redefining if you think about it.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And you did mention this, I believe, earlier on, but it was to do with the sort of bear with me. Mm-hmm. Just trying to choose a good one here. Mm-hmm. Bear with me. Oh, I've lost it. It's okay. Oh yeah. And there was one that you did mention earlier on. I did want to just mention this as well. The sort of the got meaning, in a sense of the the crisis side of it as well. What is my meaning now? As in, like, for someone that's maybe build a lot of wealth or done what society would see as to be very commendable and congratulations. Sorry, start again there. Hang on, 2 seconds. Yeah, and another one I wanted to ask you as well was the sort of meaning, get meaning, existential crisis, in a sense, where you could have been what could have been seen from the outside world as being very you're a doctor, or you're someone that's achieved status, but actually you've got no meaning within inside you.
Well, interesting in a way. There's a kind of a blessing, and it also gets you there quicker. Like a lot of times people put their heads down and really actualize their dreams and imagine that, hey, when I get that house and that car and I set that whole thing up, I'm going to be happy. And then, they find out, like I've worked with a couple of people over the years who are, your masters of the universe. They've piled up a whole bunch of money, and then they realized they were, it came at the expense of not having relationship in their life. Or, they had kids and they never really got to know them. I mean, I'm not judgmentally saying anything wrong with that, but there's a way in which maybe a disproportionate focus can go on certain areas of life that in one way enables people to achieve certain success, but sometimes it also detracts from them being able to experience other things that add meaning in life, a sense of connection with others or feeling love in their life. And those become really evident when the other areas are actualized. It's almost like, oh, now I got it, and it's still me, and I'm not feeling as happy, and I'm even doubly bummed out now because I thought that was gonna make me happy. And that's, it's great to be, I guess like they say, if money can't buy you happiness, I'd rather have it and do my own shopping. But, there is an element of saying, there's other dimensions in life that add richness and meaningfulness. It doesn't have to be, go out and solve the problems of the world. It could be very simple. My meaning may be I might not want to aspire to be a doctor or a lawyer or something somebody others might think really successful. I might find meaning in just doing my job and bringing home, money and being able to support my family. That's my meaning. It doesn't have to be grandiose, but it does help if you have a reason to get out of bed every day. And that whole existential area, there's a man by the name of Yalom who's a therapist who talks about these underlying about four key areas. Four, I shouldn't say keys because I already used those, but four areas in existential crises for people. A lot of them is coming to terms with death, because a lot of people don't think about death. And interestingly, Carl Jung, this psychiatrist who was a colleague of Sigmund Freud, he said the awareness of death is what sometimes triggers a midlife crisis. Like, it's not going to last forever. And have I done everything I want to do with my life? Or have I spent it singularly focused in one area that isn't necessarily, I'm not, the person on the deathbed doesn't look back and say, I wish I spent more time at the office, kind of an idea. But, then he talks about meaning and responsibility and freedom as key existential issues. And a lot of people don't enjoy freedom and, have a sense of opportunities to do things that feel meaningful.
No, it's so true. It's so true. Yeah, when you lose that sense of freedom, try being in jail for a few years, or a bit longer. I think you would soon think differently then. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, yeah.
Sure. Things we're talking about are like higher. Like, you have to have the opportunities to be able to move on to this. If you're just literally, and it may just be where your life is at, you may, the luck of the draw, you might be just spending your whole life just basically trying to survive. And who's got time to, like the old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you've got, food and shelter and you're comfortable, then you can move on to some of these other areas that maybe add richness to life. But if not, you're going to be focused on just your physical well-being and be preoccupied with that most of the time.
Yeah. Well, another, one that you mentioned is human being or human doing existential crisis.
Well, a lot of people spend a lot of time just doing, and not being able to just be. So like when you hear they say, stop and smell the roses. There is an element of, learning how to just be still. And sometimes it's in the stillness where you get in touch with those dimensions of yourself that can add richness to life. And people can get so busy they look up and decades go by, and they feel like they missed opportunities to just savor some life experiences, and I think of just being as being still. It's not necessarily a waste of time, for instance, to go for a walk in the woods or sit by a river or do something where you're just still with yourself, just like meditation. Sometimes people would say, I'm too busy to meditate or relax. And it's like, oh gosh, take some time and allow yourself to just be. And that's kind of how I differentiate that.
So what are some of the regrets that clients have come with? Hang on. What are some of the common regrets that clients come to you with, in a sense? Is there some sort of thread that a lot of people will have said the same thing but in different ways?
Well, it is. I mean, there are varieties of different things. I think one of them is maybe wishing they had followed a path that was of their own design. A lot of people, when they get to midlife or later on in life, they'll realize that maybe the voices of their parents or other people contributed to them taking a certain course in life, that when they look back now, they wish they would have been that dancer, or they would have done that work, or they would have gotten to that different field. There could be some regrets, and that also could be something that, precipitates the crisis, which they could ultimately maybe move into. There could be, like I said earlier, there might be people who are so busy doing and not being that they may say, I had kids and they're grown and they're gone and I don't really know them. Wish I can go back. I mean, I've had that thought myself. I mean, I've tried to give plenty of time to my children, but I often think, boy, I wish I could go back for a week to when they were young and just savor that, because we're all so busy sometimes thinking, oh, I got to feed these kids and I got to do all these different things. So sometimes, it doesn't have to be deep, deep regrets. It could be, wishing I had a time to talk to my parents or share some of the thoughts that I never broached with them, and now they're gone. Or I wished I would have maybe hung in there and worked through some of the conflicts in that relationship, and maybe it would have been able to, navigate its way through those troubled times, and we'd still be, together. So sometimes, you make a turn, or you just look back with the wisdom and the perspective of age, like the hindsight is 20/20, as they say.
Yeah, that is so true. Now in your book you sort of differentiate between what is considered abnormal, normal, and supernormal functioning of the mind. Could you add more to that?
Well, sure. So, for example, somebody may be hallucinating because they are either in a state that's contributed to by, some onset of sort of psychosis or, you'd have to say, okay, that is really, they really are dealing with something here that needs to be both medicated and maybe counseled, and that would be abnormal. The normal usually doesn't give us much, to be troubled about. But, even if somebody comes in and will say, well, they're going through a normal process of grieving in the aftermath of a death, or, they're just dealing with, I'm in a college town here, so, you find a lot of normal developmental issues with older adolescents maybe who are dealing with, emancipation issues and moving out from home, or some of the things that they have to adjust to. And then you get into the supernormal range, which is some of the things that would be considered indicative of maybe psychic functioning, qualities of the mind that are not as familiar, but they're not dysfunctional. And that's the term. There's a book out now also by Dean Radin, who's I think a brilliant. He's both got a PhD in engineering and psychology, and he's done some really interesting research on capturing, beyond the shadow of a doubt, with research that's really tightly done so that it can hold up to all the skeptics and everybody who's trying to poke holes in it, to show that there are abilities that people can anticipate something that hasn't happened yet. And so, that would be considered a supernormal capacity.
Right. Okay. Well, obviously, your book is available from Amazon, and we're going to link that in the description below as well. Do you have a website?
I do. My name, frankpasciuti.com. Just spell the Pasciuti right, you'll get to it. It's and I have both a little bit about how I do therapy on there, a little bit about the book, the preface, why I use the chrysalis crisis metaphor, and a little bit about the index, or the index, the table of contents, so people can see, what the chapters are about. The first half is kind of like conventional, and so it's helpful, and it's written in a very storytelling. I write the book the way I would talk to a client. I'm not here to impress people with big words, and also trying to say, hey, this is a conversation, and I'm willing to share. I share a lot about myself. I don't use it as my stage, but I'm thinking, hey, I'm out there learning like everybody else. And sometimes people do find it helpful when they see the therapist struggles with things they've struggled with or has at one time.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. What would you say then, Frank, is the most important message of this book?
Well, that you put your finger on it earlier, that we do face crises in life. There is suffering in life. It doesn't have to be all the time. And there's change. So I open the book with the idea that there's always going to be change, and there may be suffering at times. But once you navigate through the initial impact of the crisis, if you look back with any self-examination, or you are willing to say, okay, in the Chinese way, crisis can be an opportunity, that it may actually open a door for growth. And here's where the transformation is allowed. Like the metaphor is the butterfly after the meltdown, which once somebody said, yeah, we all go through these meltdowns. So just like the butterfly, or at least the caterpillar, that there's a struggle to release themselves from the cocoon. But the interesting thing about that struggle, you can see the butterfly trying to free its wings from the cocoon, but it's got two reasons. One is to free itself. The other one is it strengthens the wings for flight. And so it has a dual purpose. The struggle strengthens you for flight. It strengthens you for your journey through life if you use it that way. It's possible. Not everybody will choose to, but there's always a chance that the crisis is going to awaken you to things about yourself that can change and grow. And you'll never, you may never bring back the person who you lost, for instance, if it's something like that, but you may come out a lot stronger.
Well, Frank, I just want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to talk to you about this. I appreciate your interest.